Hello, I'm Susanna with Science with Susanna, and today's video is going to be all about the skull. I am going to talk to you about every bone of the skull, the cranial bones and the facial bones, and all of the significant markings that your teachers will ask you on your anatomy test. Let's get going. First, we're going to look at the cranial bones, and I'm going to start with the frontal bone. Let's outline what's called a suture, which is where the frontal bone meets with another bone. And here it is. Comes down from the bridge of the nose. So you can see it makes up the top of the eye orbit. This particular suture is called the coronal suture. And you can see it right here. And here you can remember it's a zigzaggy line where collagen fibers knit together these bones. And when you're first born, they are not yet knit together, and that's how a baby can fit through the birth canal. Now, on this other picture, we can see the outline of the frontal bone. You see right here where the bridge of the nose starts? That is going to be part of the line. And then it actually makes up the top of the eye orbit. So we're going to go over like this. I can see where its border is, like that. And then we're going to look and see on the other side. And it goes above that. Do you see that kind of hole at the back of the eye orbit? That is called the superior orbital fissure. And some cranial nerves go through that. Looks like the line was, that's where the suture was right there. See that? So now we're going to go ahead and just color this in on both sides. So this is the frontal bone. Makes up the top of the eye orbit, the front of the skull, and has a border called the coronal suture. Very commonly asked on exams. It also has two little holes for nerves. I think they're right about there. Those are called the supraorbital foramen. I put a little skull down here, the top of one, just so you can see from up above what the coronal suture would look like. And then we could go ahead and just color this in. That's the frontal bone from two different views, a sagittal view and a frontal view. Next, we'll look at the parietal bones. That word parietal comes from the word pared or wall. And you've got two of these, one on each side of your head. I'm going to outline the edges of the parietal bone. See, there's another suture. Wherever bones come together, it's not perfectly easy to see, but I can mostly see that's where the edges are. And on this particular frontal view, I can't see the parietal. It might be like right around here, but for the purposes of what we're doing, let's not worry about that. So that's the parietal bones, and we can color those in right here. We can also show here is a suture that separates the two parietal bones. And maybe not surprisingly, because of its location, it is called the sagittal suture. Sagittal suture. See it right there? Now, the back of the parietal bones meet up with yet another suture where the occipital lobe is. So I'm going to make it right here, and it's basically right here. We can put orange right here. This is the occipital bone right back here. Occipital. Right there. And then you can see it just a little bit on this top-down view. The lambdoid suture is the name given to where the parietal bones meet up with the occipital bone. There's one more suture I want to show you, and that's called the squamous suture. Squamous means flat, and that's because this is on the flat side of your skull. And it's going to be made primarily of a bone called the temporal, which we're going to do next. And then the lambdoid suture. Put the label on here again. That's that orange one right there. Sutures have squiggles, so these with squiggles to remind ourselves of that. Next, let's look at the very interesting and intricate temporal bone. So here it is, right along the border of the parietal bone, just like that. And then we're going to have it go down like this. This part right here is called the mastoid process. Mastoid process. Important marking for muscle attachment. And then that green border will go up like this and make a kind of a spike right there. That's called the styloid process. Styloid process is also part of the temporal bone. And then do you see this hole that goes through the temporal bone? That's your external acoustic meatus. That's where your ear canal is. Continue bordering it. Goes up and along. And then you see this part right here? That's where your lower jaw articulates with your temporal bone. And so we call that the mandibular fossa. Here, I'll go just do one thing so you can tell. Mandibular fossa. A fossa is a groove or a depression that another bone can fit into. In this case, the mandible can fit up into that, and it forms your temporal mandibular joint. Maybe you've heard of your TM. The temporal bone also has an arch that goes out onto your face. You see that? Doesn't go the whole way. And then it has a border right up here. It's going to border with another bone called the sphenoid bone. Did you get all of that? Now, if we look on the other side, we can't really see any of the temporal bone from this view. It's going to be mostly a bone called the zygomatic on that edge. I'm going to color in the temporal bone with its markings, the mastoid process, the external. I'm going to leave that open since it's a hole. The external acoustic meatus, the styloid process, which also has some muscle attachments, and then the zygomatic arch, which is made up partially of this temporal bone and partially up of another bone called the zygomatic that we haven't yet looked at. So this is the arch, the zygomatic arch. Maybe I'll just write it right on there like that. Let's label temporal bone. There you go, just like that. And there are two of these. They are paired. You have one on both sides of your head. Next, we'll look at the sphenoid bone. This is a very unique and interesting bone that makes up a very internal part of your brain case, your skull, and it articulates with all of these other cranial bones. And I'll show you here some of these articulations. So look, here it's articulating with the frontal bone, and here with the parietal, and here with the temporal. And it will also articulate with the ethmoid bone, which I haven't shown you yet. We're going to color that in. That is the sphenoid bone. You can see it on both sides, although it's just one bone that goes all the way across your skull. Now, let's look at the more complex parts. I will put an arrow to it right here. Sphenoid. And I love to draw it over here. It's very fun looking. Do you see this hole right here at the back of the eye? So see how the sphenoid bone is meeting up with the frontal bone and then coming down like this. And it goes right along the top of a hole called the inferior orbital fissure, which is a passageway for blood vessels and nerves. And then it goes back up to another, includes this hole called the superior orbital fissure. And that is another passageway for multiple cranial nerves, actually. So we'll go ahead and put this this border right here. Bring it down. This along that inferior orbital fissure and up along the superior orbital fissure. This gives you a nice look at the sphenoid bone from the frontal view. It goes all the way across. You can't see where it's connecting behind the nose, but it is. Go ahead and put arrow on that. We have one more bone to look at for the cranial bones, and that's called the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone can be seen. I think I'll use the picture on the right first. Look at this. All of this is part of the ethmoid bone. You see that? That's called your perpendicular plate, and it makes up the top half of your nasal septum. And then it's these sides of the inside of your nose, too. This right here is one of the turbinates, or the nasal conchae. The superior and middle bumps are part of the ethmoid. You can't see the superior in these pictures. And then that lower one is actually a separate bone called the inferior nasal conchae. And this other lower part is called the vomer. Those are facial bones that we'll look at later. So it's this whole broad bone that reaches back to your nasal passages right there. That's the ethmoid. Now you can see it just a tiny bit peek out over on the left picture. Not very much of it. It's right behind another bone called the lacrimal. But we'll just outline it right here, color it in just a little bit, and put an arrow to it that this is the ethmoid bone. And a few important markings that I just mentioned. You've got the nasal conchae, the superior and middle. I'm just going to put nasal conchae to keep it simple. And also, and very importantly, the perpendicular plate. Perpendicular means it's standing upright, so that's how it gets its name. Perpendicular plate that makes up top part of your nasal septum. If someone has a deviated nasal septum, this purple part, the perpendicular plate, doesn't match up nicely with the bottom part yet. That's the vomer. We haven't colored that yet. Because the purpose on this page was to go over the cranial bones. So the cranial and bones include the frontal bone, the parietal bones, the occipital bone, the temporal bones, the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. Those are all of them together. And then the sutures that you need to know are the coronal suture, the sagittal suture, the lambdoid suture, and the squamous suture that you can only see over on that left picture. We'll continue looking at the cranial bones and their markings with two new views. This is a superior view, and we call this the cranial cavity. The top has been removed. Then on the right, this is an inferior view, like you've turned the skull upside down in your hand, and the mandible has been removed, so we can see more bones. Let's use the same color coding scheme and start with the frontal bone. I'm going to outline the frontal bone. To do this, I like to zoom in so I can see where the borders are on here. Start with the easy ones. Like I can see there's clearly a suture along this line. So this must be part of the frontal bone or the border of it. And then sometimes it's a little hard to see. That's where I come in handy, right? I can show you where those boundaries should be. So all of this is the frontal bone on this side, and it ends around here. This is the ethmoid bone that's coming up, and so the frontal bone is going to end right around there. So we're going to go ahead and color this in. These other holes, like right here and here, those are just because this is a model of a skull and it fits together. It has little pieces. So those are not actual markings on a real skull. That's just left over. See, like right there? because it's been produced. So the students like you can study. Since we're right there, we'll do the ethmoid bone next. You can see the border of it right through here. You can see that there are holes. They're tiny. They're for your olfactory neurons, and there's a ridge down the middle. All of this is a vision of the ethmoid bone that then will go down through the bottom of your nose. Those little holes are called the cribriform plate. A crib is something that has holes in it, and that's for your olfactory neurons. And then the crista galli means coxcomb, and it is the ridge. It literally means that little red part on the top of a rooster's head. So it's a ridge. The cribriform plate is going to be the holes, and the crista galli is that ridge in the middle. Now I'm going to outline the sphenoid bone as we can see it when we look down into the cranial cavity. I'm trying to follow these lines again. And it's going to include this little hole right here. That's called the foramen spinosum. And this hole right here, that's the foramen ovale. You can see it on this side too. And the foramen spinosum right there. Then there's a ridge line connecting, and then we're going to continue down. Below that foramen spinosum, trying to follow along the natural sutures, this model, kind of like that. There's another hole right here. This is called the optic canal. It's for your optic nerves. Cranial nerve number 2 has this neat little ridge on both sides. Goes across like this. Then there's a saddle, like the pommel on a saddle. And right in the middle of those is a kind of a deep groove called the sella turcica for the pituitary gland. Color this in. Go around those holes, foramen spinosum, foramen ovale. Then this other one right here, I should actually have a line around it to let you see. You can see the hint of the jugular foramen right there. You can see it better from the other view. We'll look at that in a second here. And this is also part of it. So that's the sphenoid from this view. Sphenoid, put it all in capitals. And then we'll do this on the other side too. It's a little harder, I think, on this side to outline it. Luckily, you won't get asked this typically on a quiz. So let me find that foramen ovale right here, the foramen spinosum. So they go right through the skull from the superior view to the inferior. Then there is a little gap right here called the foramen lacerum. In a real skull that's alive, that will actually just be covered with cartilage. It won't be a visible hole. The sphenoid bone has these really cool ridges. It goes all the way down that, and then I can see, do this on the other side. This part I have to just make my best estimate for where it's going through here. You can see a little bit of that ridge line, like that, the suture. We're enclosing and up like that. This would also be part of the sphenoid. Down and under the foramen lacerum. Also under the spinosum. So that's going to be the sphenoid from this viewpoint. And go ahead and color that in. Don't color in the holes. These are all passages for nerves and blood vessels, for cranial nerves, that is, and various blood vessels that feed your brain. Looks pretty nice. Now we'll go ahead and put some labels on those. So the first hole I mentioned to you was the optic canal. That's the passageway for your optic nerve. You can only see this one on the picture on the left, right there. And those go and allow the optic chiasm to cross. Then the next one down is the sella turcica. And this is going to hold your pituitary gland. Right here. It's the Turk's saddle is what it translates to. Then we have the foramen ovale, or a branch of cranial nerve number 5. And just below that, a smaller hole called the foramen spinosum. It also holds a little branch of cranial nerve number 5. See this little guy right here? Then there's one called the foramen lacerum, which is difficult to see from this angle. You can only see a little bit of the foramen lacerum from the view on the left. You can see it better on the right. It actually tucks in right here. Let's look on this side and see what we can find. So here's the foramen ovale. Here's the foramen spinosum. Here's a better view of the foramen lacerum. Next, we'll outline and look closely at the markings of the temporal bone that we can see from this view. So we'll start on the left. Let's see if I zoom in, you can see the edge of the temporal bone coming down and then heading inward. See that line? Now it's going to form the top of the jugular foramen. That right there. Several cranial nerves go through there and then go ahead and go up and join the sphenoid. See that? Then it's going to do the same thing on this side. So once you figure out one side, you can guess a little bit, even if you can't see the sutures very well. Depends on the quality of the model that you're working with, how well you can see those sutures. I can see it here, and then it must come down so, and then go all the way up to join with the sphenoid. We can color that in. Temporal bone, jugular foramen right there. It's a big hole for several cranial nerves. Got to have holes in the skull, right? If those nerves are going to get from the brain and out to the face and neck. Let's look on the other side. On this picture, I can see the edges where it starts on the zygomatic arch. So I know it's going to go like this and then down. And I can just get a hint of where it goes inward like that. It's going to include this thing called the mastoid process. It's going to go along the jugular foramen here and then up and join with the sphenoid right there. So I can get a sense of its scope and sequence through here like that. Do you see that? So you can see right here, the carotid canal, which is the passageway for your carotid artery. Then you can see a little hole right here. I can find this. I know on this side it doesn't really look like a hole, but it is. And that is the stylomastoid foramen, because there's a little protrusion, real hard to see in an inferior view unless you're in a lab looking at it, but I can see it right there. Then there's this large lump right here called the mastoid process. Both of these serve as attachments for muscles. And that hole in between is called the stylomastoid foramen. Let me finish my outlining over here. Follow the suture down until we reach the edge. This structure right here that I'm outlining is the mandibular fossa. It's where your mandible meets up with the top part of your skull, and so it forms your TMJ, or your temporal mandibular joint. We can go ahead and color this in now. Now, there is one more hole down here. I don't think this gets asked on very many intro to anatomy classes, but that's the mastoid foramen. A little bit of the zygomatic arch right there, and then the styloid process going around the carotid canal. I'm also going to go around the jugular foramen so I don't fill that in accidentally. And around the stylomastoid foramen, and then fill this in on the other side. This is actually a hole, the carotid canal. Don't fill that in. Mandibular fossa, where the mandible attaches to the skull, rest of the skull. Stylomastoid foramen, it's a hole between the mastoid process right here and the styloid process. Then at the very posterior part of the temporal bone, there's one more little hole for a nerve called the mastoid, or actually I think it's for a blood vessel, called the mastoid foramen. I wouldn't worry too much about that one in an intro class. So let's go ahead and put those labels on there. The mandibular fossa, which is only seen in the right view, right here, right there. The carotid canal for the carotid artery. Can only see that on the inferior view. So the carotid artery gets into the brain. The jugular foramen, seen on both views. Right here. And also right here, the mastoid process. And then leave a little gap and put the styloid process. And in between those is a hole that's called the stylomastoid foramen. So it's a hole. Here's the mastoid process. Here is the stylomastoid foramen. And you can barely see it, but right there is the styloid process. Maybe if I outline that a little bit on both sides. The projection that goes up. Things get a little bit easier when we're outlining and coloring the parietal bones on this view. If I zoom in, I can see where it looks like it joins with the temporal on that side. And then over here, it's going to join. Look, I can see that suture line right there. Do you see that? Right there? Even on this fairly inexpensive model that I was taking pictures of to get this ready for you. There's that side and that side. Color, parietal. And you can't see it from the inferior view. So that's the parietal bone. Remember, there are two of those, one on either side. There it is. Then we'll finish up with the gigantic occipital bone, which can be seen in both of these views, both the cranial cavity and the inferior view. So look, right here in the center of it, this is the foramen magnum. This is the hole for your spinal cord. And then on either side of that, on the inferior view, you can see these protrusions. They're curved and rounded. They're called the occipital condyles. And they're where your first vertebrae, your atlas, attaches. It articulates there, can rock back and forth so you can nod your head yes. Then I'll go ahead and color this in. So all of this is occipital when you're looking down into the cranial cavity. Notice that it forms, maybe I should do this, forms the bottom part of the jugular foramen. So the temporal bone and the occipital bone, where they come together, forms that jugular foramen where several cranial nerves can exit from the brain. Gotta have holes so that things can get through. There it is on that side. And then here are those occipital condyles. And then this is all occipital bone too. Oops, right up to here. And then we'll just add some lines for the foramen magnum right here. You can see it here and on this side. And the occipital condyles you can only see from that inferior view. And that'll do it for the cranial bones. Next, we'll look at the facial bones. Let's look at the facial bones now. This skull picture I took of a skeleton in my classroom, and the red that you see on it is where certain muscles attach, and the blue is where those muscles attach again. We call those the origin and insertion. And when we get to the muscles, we'll learn more about that. But try not to let that distract you. It's not something that we need to be looking at today. I'm just using this face to show you the facial bones. So I'm going to start with the nasal bone. And we'll color that red. I'm going to outline it. It actually is a paired bone. So you see how there's going to be two parts to it. And you can see where the boundaries are. Sometimes because I know where the boundaries are, it might be harder for you to see than me, but you can generally trust me. I do make mistakes on this, but for the purposes of our baby A&P class that you're taking this semester, it's okay if I don't always have exactly the right border on a bone. Trust me, even though it might be frustrating if you ever catch that. And I don't think I did that one wrong. Oh, so if you break your nose, that's when you're breaking this bone right here. And this area right here in front, that is where cartilage makes up the rest of your nose. And that's where everyone can have such unique nose shapes, right? And that cartilage keeps growing your whole life. So our noses get bigger as we get older. Isn't that terrible? Unless you have a little nose and you hope it gets bigger. Okay, then we'll do the vomer. The vomer makes up the bottom of your nasal septum, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone makes up the top. So we'll say nasal septum bottom half. So if someone has a deviated septum, it's because the connection right here, do you see that between where, I actually did that a little high. The connection between the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone has not connected properly. And then surgically, they can repair that if it's bad enough, because it can cause a lot of breathing problems, sinus problems, etc. So I'll go ahead and color the vomer right here. The bottom of your nasal septum has this weird bump to the side on it. So that's your vomer. Next, we'll look at the inferior nasal conchae. And these create turbulence for air as it comes in your nose. And that makes the air spend more time there. Watch down here in the nose, and I'm highlighting these in for you. Do you see these? These are the nasal conchae. And notice that above them, you can see two more bumps here, and there's actually another one above that. So you have superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. The superior and middle nasal conchae are part of your ethmoid bone, and the inferior nasal conchae is a bone on its own. And the purpose of slowing down the air as it comes in with these turbinates, these nasal conchae, is it gives the air time to get cleaned by your nose hairs and get caught by mucus. It gives it time to be warmed up so that when it hits your lungs, it's not so cold that it could damage the delicate lining. And it also gives the air time to be humidified so that, again, when it reaches your lungs, gas exchange will be efficient because dry air is going to decrease the efficiency and actually damage the delicate lung lining. Now we'll look at your upper jaw, which is called your maxillae. I'm doing the maxillae for plural because you have two of them. Okay, now this is fun. Once you start getting into the groove, and don't worry about being a perfectionist, but you can see these sutures even on this plastic model. Do you see that? So this is going to be the maxilla bones. And I can see it a little to make it up a little bit right there. But it comes down. It actually goes to the back of your eye orbital. We'll look at that again before we're done with the video today. Then you see it coming along, and there's another bone over there called the zygomatic. That's your cheekbone, and that's where this maxilla ends. Now, if we just copy that on the other side, could maybe see right there. Almost makes itself done for you. And then, of course, this is all part of the upper jaw. And then these indents where there's these big sockets, actually, they're called the alveolar margin, where you can see where the teeth go into those sockets. Now I'm going to color this. Oh, actually, I want to put a circle around. This is right here called the infraorbital foramen. And it's a place for nerves and blood vessels. And I think particularly the fifth cranial nerve, for the maxillary branch that gives you sense of feeling on your face. Okay, now notice that the maxilla makes up much of the base of your nasal cavity right there. Just like that. The walls right there too. It's big, isn't it? Big bone. All the way up here. Going to the back of the eye orbit. Going around the infraorbital foramen. And there you have it. That's the two paired maxillae bones. I'm going to add right here the infraorbital. So that means it's under the orbital, which that's your eye socket, right? And in this case, it's called cranial nerve 5. You'll learn those this semester. The trigeminal, there's a branch of it. You can see how it's 3 branches called the maxillary branch. And so I'll go ahead and draw a line to that. So see that? Got to have those holes in the bones so stuff can go through. And then the other important marking here is the alveolar margin. The word alveolar means like a grate, and I think it's because the teeth fit into the sockets there. And you're going to have that on your upper and lower jaw. And these are joints. It's called a gomphosis. And this is an immovable joint that's formed by a periodontal ligament. If it loosens, your teeth fall out. So that we'll call the maxilla the upper jaw. Onto the mandible, that's your lower jaw. This one's not paired. You can see again with my yellow pen, I'm outlining the alveolar margin of the lower jaw. And then it goes up and it fits into the temporal bone right here, forming your TMJ. And you've got a couple of holes right here. Can't see it on this side very well. Supposed to be, let's just say it's right here. Those are called the mental foramen. Go ahead and color this in. The mandible, and you can see the alveolar margin. Again. And you can also see what are called the mental foramen. So I know that you might think, mental, why are they calling it that? It means chin. Can also mean or mind. And it's a hole for another part of the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve to give you sense of feeling on your jaw. Then we'll do the zygomatic. Those are your cheekbones. Go ahead and try to outline these as best we can. And coming close like this. Look at that, I can see it. You getting good at this? Look at that. I can see border right through there. I can color it in. So it's going to make up part of the zygomatic arch, the more anterior part. And then the temporal bone makes up the posterior part of the zygomatic arch. And then we can draw it over here. You see that outline coming in like this, going down, around like that. Okay, then the lacrimal. That word lacrimar means tears. It's here, and then I'm just imagining it there. I'll show it to you on a side view. This is where your tears drain. The palatine. This means like roof. This is the roof of your mouth. You can't see it in this view, but I'll show you in another. We have to look at an inferior view. Let's continue looking at the facial bones from two different views. We can look at the 14 facial bones with this sagittal view. And here is an inferior on the right. Do you see this is an inferior view? We've looked at this before for the cranial bones, and now we're going to focus on the facial bones. Up first, the nasal bone. This nasal bone can be seen in the left figure, and I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to outline it. You can probably start to get pretty good at this. See, this is the nasal bone. You can see that suture, and then I have to make it up along here, but I can see it there. Then we'll color that in. And draw an arrow that this is the nasal bone. And there are two of these, one on each side. Next, we can get a much better view of the lacrimal bone from this view than we could in the one on the previous page. And remember that lacrimal means tears. And so this is where tears drain down from your eyes into your nasal passages. You can get a really nice view of it here when we do this close up. You can even see the indent right there. You see how the tears are going to be draining down that way into the lacrimal sac. And we'll put our arrow. Next, we'll look at the zygomatic. Look at this. Doop, 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 doop. You can see the borders very nicely, can't you? So this is going to be where, right here is where it borders with the frontal bone, and right here is where it borders with the temporal bone. Then I'm just going to outline it for you and color that zygomatic bone in. This bone serves as an attachment for a muscle called the zygomaticus. And that muscle goes down it attaches here and it goes down to the corners of your mouth. And so when it pulls upward, it makes you smile. Next, we'll look at the maxilla. And I can see this one on both of these views pretty easily. So we can color it in both places. First, we'll look at what we did on the previous page, but from the side. You can see that it's going to go up. It meets with the nasal, then it meets with the lacrimal. There's the alveolar margins along because it's the top jaw. This is the upper jaw. You can't see all of it, but you can see where it peeks out right here. Then we're going to color this in. This is the upper jaw. Contains the alveolar margin, forms bottom of the nasal cavity, bottom of the eye orbit. Now let's see where it also forms the roof of the mouth. Look on the right pictures where I'm going to be coloring now. And right here is where the maxilla is. There's two sides to it actually. And this structure right here, that is just because this is a plastic model and this is where the mandible attaches. Okay, now I have to peek a little bit here. So, this is about the best I can tell for how this bone goes. This might not be exactly perfect, but it's close enough. Look at those alveolar margins. You can see where the teeth fit into the sockets, and those form a joint called a gomphosis. They're held into the teeth sockets with periodontal ligaments. So that's why sailors would get scurvy because they didn't have enough vitamin C. The collagen of the periodontal ligaments would break down and their teeth would get loose in their sockets and maybe even fall out. You have to have enough vitamin C to have strong collagen. So you can see the maxilla here forming the roof of the mouth, and then you can see it here forming the rest of the upper jaw. You have a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate is formed from bone and the soft palate from softer connective tissue. Let's look at the other part of the hard palate next. The palatine bone, you can hear palate right in it, can't you? Forms the roof of the mouth. So it's the back half of the hard palate. Here it is right here, roughly. I'm not doing it perfectly, I'm sure, but. And it has two sides to it too, two palatine bones that fuse together. If someone is born with a cleft palate, something went wrong with the fusion between the two sides or with where it joins with the maxilla. The vomer is next. We were able to see that on the other page. And then here we can see it as well. This is the vomer. You can see it comes down. Now we're looking up at the vomer where it forms the bottom part of the nasal septum. Remember that the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone forms the top part of the nasal septum. And so if someone has a deviated septum, something has gone wrong there with either the congenital formation or maybe from an injury, it got deviated, meaning they're not connected the way they should. Next is the mandible. On this left image, you can see where the top of the lower jaw connects with the temporal bone, and that's called the mandibular condyle. A condyle is a rounded projection, and it fits into the mandibular fossa that is on the temporal bone. Then here's the rest of the lower jaw. You can see the alveolar sockets where the teeth form an immovable joint called a gomphosis, thanks to the tight connection of the periodontal ligaments. Can also see the mental foramen where a branch of the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, gives you sense of feeling on your lower jaw. So we can color that one in. Put some labels on here. So you've got the mandibular condyle, fits into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone to form your TMJ or your temporomandibular joint. Most everyone knows someone that has like weird popping or pain there. Notice right here, this is on the right picture right here. These are the mandibular fossas. And then the mandibular condyle should be labeled over here. See, that's the spot where it fits into the mandibular fossa on the temporal. Muscles, such as the masseter and the temporalis, are going to attach to the lower jaw via the coronoid process. Let me go like this. Purpose of this coronoid process is for masseter and temporalis chewing muscles to attach. You can imagine if you had a muscle that was attached here and it went up under there and then spread out onto the temporal bone. That's what the temporalis does. And so you can see that when it shortens, it can pull the mandible closed. Last couple of things I want to show you on here are actually part of the cranial structures as well. But you can see that from here to here, I'm looking on the left picture right here, this forms the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch has two bones that are part of it, both the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone. The other thing I want to show on here is I want to draw a circle and bring your attention. Do you remember that this is the frontal bone? Here is the parietal bone. Here is the temporal bone. And here is the sphenoid bone. These bones all come together at this location right here that we call the temple. And this area is particularly fragile. The bones here are a little bit thinner and more fragile for fracture. And also, important arteries pass through this area. This could be a particularly consequential injury if it occurs in this part of the skull. Let's look at the eye orbit and the nasal passages. On the picture on the left, you are looking at a left eye. Here is the zygomatic bone. Here's the maxilla. Over here, you can see the nasal passages. I want to start with the lacrimal bone. I'm going to outline it. And you can see right here that there's an opening for tears to drain down from the lacrimal ducts to go into the nasal passageways. Right behind that, you can see the ethmoid bone. I can follow along on the border of the ethmoid bone. It's quite visible, a little hard to see where it ends at the back, but maybe something like that. We can get a really cool view of a couple other parts of the ethmoid bone as we look into the nasal cavity. This is the middle nasal conchae, right here and here. There is an upper nasal conchae, but it is hard to see. It's farther back. All of this is the ethmoid bone. And look, I can even see right there where it ends. I'm looking in. The ethmoid is such an interesting shaped bone. And we'll talk on the next page about air cells in it. It has to lighten itself, nasal sinuses within it. Next, we'll look at the sphenoid bone. And I'll do my best to outline this. It goes along the top. The frontal bone is above it, and it encloses this structure right here called the superior orbital fissure. I think it looks like it comes all the way to right here. It forms the upper border of the inferior orbital fissure, like that. Forms the optic canal right there. This is the sphenoid. The optic canal is an opening for the optic nerve to exit from the back of the eye and carry sensory information to your brain. The superior orbital fissure is a passageway for several cranial nerves from your brain. I think it's 3, 4, and 6 go through there. The maxilla makes up the bottom of the eye orbit. I think it goes something like this in this picture. And then you can see the zygomatic makes up a little bit of the side, and then the frontal makes up the top. See, the frontal is in yellow. Got my lines mixed up. The inferior orbital fissure is made up of the borders of multiple bones. You can see it has several bones around it. A couple more things to look at in the nasal passage over here is that the inferior nasal conchae, that bottom of the three, is right here, makes up this bone right here. The vomer can be seen here. And you can see again in this picture that the bottom of the nasal passages are actually formed by the maxilla. The very last topic we'll do today are just exploring the paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are mucus-lined cavities within some skull bones. They serve to lighten the skull and they help your voice resonate. There are 4 of them. The first one, you can look on the picture on the left, and they are in the frontal bone in this area here, like this. You generally, when you have sinus pressure, you'll push on this spot instinctively to try and get them to drain a little bit better. So these are sinuses in the frontal bone, and they drain into the nasal cavity by channels through the bone near the nasal conchae. Over on my picture on the right, the frontal sinuses can just be drawn right here like this. They are going to drain down into the nasal passages. Next up, the maxillary sinuses. You might also find yourself pressing on this part of your face if you have sinus pressure. So the maxillary bones have cavities in them that are lined with mucous membrane, and they also drain into the nasal cavity by channels through the bone near the nasal conchae. On my picture on the right, you can just draw the maxillary sinuses, something like this. And they also are going to be draining into the nasal passages. Next up, the ethmoid air cells. These ones get their name because rather than just being one large cavity within the bone that's lined with a mucous membrane, there are multiples of these. You can't really see them from the frontal view. We have to look over here on the side, and there's just little cavities within that funny shaped ethmoid bone. And sure enough, just like the others, they also will drain into the nasal cavity. So I'll put it over here on this picture. And then over here, they drain from a little bit higher up than some of the other ones and near the back. And then last is the sphenoid sinus. This one also you really only can see from the sagittal view. So I'll go ahead and zoom in here and can take a look right here. This one's kind of neat because it lies right under that structure I showed you earlier, which is called the sella turcica. And that's right where your pituitary gland sits. So that's the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And then there is this cavity within it. Just like the others, it's also going to drain into the nasal passages. So if we look over here, we can add that one too. Top, since it's near the back and then draining. A sinus infection would be when pathogens are able to get into any of these sinuses. They could climb upward through the very channels that drain the sinuses normally. And if they get in there, then they could potentially cause an infection. Now, that said, You can have clogged or blocked sinuses without having an infection at all. It could just be caused by any form of inflammation, most typically from allergies. The last thing I want to mention on here is that the lacrimal bone allows for the drainage of tears. Now, it's not considered to have a sinus in it, but it certainly has fluids that will then drain down into those nasal passages. So, the lacrimal bone allows tear drainage from your eye. And I'll just add one more arrow right here, like that. And then over on the right picture, we can show tears draining from your eyes. All right, that wraps it up. My next video will be about the vertebrae and the ribs and all of the markings on them. Oh, and on the sternum. See you in the next video.